Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great episode for you this week. First article is nonprofits may need to spend about 1/3 of their budget on overhead to thrive, contradicting a rule of thumb for donors. Is that old 10% adage of overhead allocation or overhead expense really true? There's a new article that maybe points differently, but we'll talk about it this week. And then we talk about fundraising when times are bad, specifically around events. What do you do in an economic downturn? Do you still run your events? Do you still put a lot of emphasis on fundraising events? We'll talk about that. Great article. And then scaling a nonprofit. Well, more specifically, how not to scale a nonprofit. And from an article this week from our favorite Stanford Social Innovation Review, we'll talk about this article and kind of give our thoughts on, scaling and expanding a nonprofit. And then our question of the week: what are some key metrics and KPIs, key performance indices, that nonprofits should use in development, HR, and accounting? We'll talk about all that this week. But Mark, you got our first article for us. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, AJ. Today's first article is called "Nonprofits May Need to Spend About 1/3 of Their Budget on Overhead to Thrive, Contradicting a Rule of Thumb for Donors." This, I thought, was an interesting dive into this project that looked at basically a whole bunch of nonprofits and what their spending was from 2008 to 2018. And they basically did a survey study and wanted to see how successful, and they looked at arts-funded organizations, first of all, and they wanted to see how successful organizations were depending on how much they spent on overhead costs. So they found that nonprofits that spend more on information technology, facilities, equipment, and program development and fundraising tend to be more successful than those that scrimp on these overhead expenses, right? And some of these costs, right, you've got your fundraising in there, but a lot of these costs are also considered admin costs. And you always hear you keep your admin costs to an absolute bare minimum, and then, try to keep it within 10%, et cetera. And AJ might have other figures when he chimes in, but, you want to keep all of your expenses in your programmatic realm. And this article, in looking at the success of some of these nonprofits, found that when arts nonprofits devoted 35% of their budget to overhead, they fared best in terms of attendance and getting people to come to these events, and in terms of getting engagement with these programs that they were trying to basically capture. And this kind of it asks for a mind reset as to what is really acceptable. And, we've talked on the podcast a number of times before how human capital is often your biggest expense in the nonprofit sphere, and getting people in there working on projects, trying to grow programs, et cetera, can be your biggest cost factor in any nonprofit. And you're trying to service a community, you're trying to plow more money into whatever your mission is. And if that mission benefits from overhead being higher, then why are we not allowing for that to happen? Why are grants, limiting the amount of administration you can have? So, this article goes into how fundraisers, they have unrealistic expectations of how much a nonprofit can do with a very low overhead. There's some graphs in here, but as soon as you have unrealistic overhead expectations, this results in some competitive pressure, like which nonprofit can act the most lean, and then this leads to neglected infrastructure and sometimes misleading reporting, right? Because it's like some organizations know what the funders are looking for, so they're going to try to shove some of these overhead costs into programs where they might not belong. So overall, I think this article is asking for nonprofit leaders and people who are thinking in this space to start to kind of rethink, is this 10% or whatever number that is realistic? And can we start shifting the mindset and look more about how many people we're serving as opposed to what the percentage of cost is? AJ, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, I thought so. One thing in the article that I noticed was that this was limited to, I think, like theaters and the art. Is very much in the arts realm, and it was based on attendance. So they're linking administrative expenses with attendance to events or programs. And so I'd be leery to say that, this can be applied, that everybody needs this. And the article clearly states this is not a new metrics or bar that they want to set, that 35% is, what the overhead is, it should be, what the overhead spending should be. It just so happens that in this niche of nonprofits, that's the sweet spot. When you spend 35% of your budget on overhead, which, let's be clear about what overhead is. It's the accounting department, it's HR, it's, fundraising and development. Those are really the three main factors. Something that doesn't have anything to do with the programs itself. And we're not talking about shared costs like insurance or rent or anything like that. We're talking stuff that is purely administrative. So when thinking about that, and I was kind of putting on my hat here of why that increased spending would translate to more attendance, and I really think, and I wish I would have broke it down further. I really think that the benefit is probably in development or in outreach that probably happened with these arts. And this is just conjecture, so I'm just trying to read between the lines here. What I do think is I think this article creates a conversation about that 10% that everybody, 10% for a long time has kind of been like the, kind of thumb in the wind to determine whether or not your nonprofit is appropriately spending on their administrative cost. I've always maintained that you need to take a good look at what your nonprofit needs as far as administrative cost goes. Like if you're running programs that are grant funded from the federal government and you have a single audit, there's probably more administrative time on your plate in the accounting and compliance department than, say, like a small donation driven startup nonprofit, from niche to niche, from nonprofit to nonprofit, your requirements of administrative costs are going to be different. And I think what the article does do a good job of talking about is how this thinking of, the least amount of administrative cost as possible is going to make us seem like a better nonprofit. And I think we've seen a shift away from this in the early 2000s when these like GuideStar and Charity Navigator scores came out that really just aggregated public data that was available and started listing everybody's administrative percentage as a direct reflection of how much your donation, if you donated $1, how much of that dollar went to administrative costs and how much of it actually went to fund what you were donating to. I think we saw a big emphasis during those early 2000s into what your administrative load was. I think we've shifted away from that a bit, in the 2020s. I think people are more kind of mission and out, kind of the impact of the nonprofit has. I think hopefully we're moving away from that, because I do think you have to have some kind of overhead to be able to meet the administrative function of your nonprofit. Now, is that 5%? Is that 10%? Is that 20%? Is that 30%? I'm here to say that I think it could be any of those, depending on the compliance load you have, depending on the number of employees that would be engaged with HR, the type of benefits you offer, the type of leadership you have, how much your executive director is involved with just the management of the organization versus how much they're doing in programs or in HR or in management of other departments. I think really it kind of encompasses all of that. And I think it can be anywhere along that sliding scale of 0 to 35. I would say that above 35%, you're putting yourself in a, kind of like the old Chinese saying, the nail that sticks up the furthest is going to get nailed down. You don't want to be an outlier in your sector, because people can compare you, if they're a really savvy donor, to other organizations in your niche. So it's almost like, and we're getting kind of like very nuts and bolts, but it's almost like an industry average when we talk about for-profits, like what should your accounting overhead be in a manufacturing company as opposed to a direct sales company? Like how is that different? I think the same thing needs to be applied to nonprofits when thinking about an overhead burden of how much compliance you have, how much, like overhead do you need? How can you shrink the bloat, still keep yourself agile, but what's a good number for you? And I think the good number is to look at other organizations in your niche or in your nonprofit sector and understand what their administrative load is and trying to understand how they arrived at that load. So is it 10%? It could be. I mean, that's what you're going to get out of governmental and state agencies as far as overhead coverage of costs. So you can scale to a fact, if you have governmental grants, you can scale to have enough of them and enough programmatic expenses that it will cover your administrative burden at 10%, even if your administrative burden is 20%. But that's going to require you to keep a lot of grants on hand and manage a lot of, which could increase your administrative load. The other option is to pick up unrestricted grants that cover that. But again, people are going to look at like their donations are going towards administrative costs. So I think it's a bit of finding how much it is, being able to express that to donors that are concerned about that, and then also be able to negotiate, for higher amounts on contracts or grants that are outside of a governmental funding agency. So it's a lot of things. I think there's a lot of moving parts here to talk about, but the main thing I want to get across is it's not always 10%, and you need to take a good hard look at your organization and understand what percentage of overhead you need to carry.
Yeah, I agree, AJ. I think there's a couple pieces that really, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, because these are arts organizations, I think a lot of their money, a lot of their percentage is going towards marketing and advertising, right? Because you have to get the word out for people to come to your museum or your theater to come and see a specific play that will grow your audience and then therefore serve more people by the programs that you're offering. And if people don't hear about it and if the word isn't getting out, then you're not serving as many people. I think really what this article, in my opinion, is trying to get at is let's look more at how many people we're serving and let's use that as a metric as opposed to these arbitrary percentages. Because the thing that really, that little hidden word that that kind of stuck with me is that organizations will manipulate their numbers to meet whatever percentage, what random percentage they say. So even when AJ says, look comparatively with industry, well, you could have an accounting department at a museum and say, well, let's put that into this program. Oh, this advertising, that was specifically for that one program. So let's throw these admin costs into that program so that they can manipulate the percentages. And then you have a race to the bottom, right? How comfortable are you kind of skewing these numbers, and what is the industry standard for skewing numbers? So I think the article is kind of saying, well, let's be realistic about what this really costs for each industry so that we can come back to how many people are we serving and is your nonprofit effective? Because nobody wants to see an admin where it's like, wow, all these people are very well paid and we have a 50% admin cost, right? So we have to figure out what's reasonable to serve the most amount of people. On that note, AJ, I think you got our second article for us.
I sure do. Actually, about what I found funny about that article was the graph they had. I suggest anybody go look at the article because I think it's well written. But the graph has somebody that spent 100% on admin at somehow. Well, of course you're not serving anybody if all your costs are going to administrative costs. But I'm wondering what organization that is that they pulled that number from that had 100%.
Yeah, not going to be around for long, right?
Yeah, no. Maybe a fundraising organization. I don't know. Anyway, our next article comes from Philanthropy Daily, and the title is, and I think it's kind of poignant, is Fundraising When Times Are Bad, Events. So it's really talking about events, what you can do, especially as we kind of look towards the U.S. economy. As we're recording this podcast, I think we're on the outset of a recession, depending on who's defining it and who's in charge, but I think we're kind of on the precipice of a economic downturn. And so they're talking about kind of understanding what to do, how to do it. They're kind of hawking their own book in this as well, but let that go. But I think the article makes some good points here. So they talk about making a clear distinction between what's considered a fundraising event and what's considered a cultivation event. And often these things are kind of intermingled. If you don't have a well-defined the development department, often fundraising events and cultivation events are probably one and the same, and they don't see a differentiation between that. The differentiation, and just to give you a definition here, is fundraising events are events where the primary aim is to raise money. Sure, there might be some relationship building and some handshaking and meeting people, but the event itself is to drive funds. A cultivation event, on the other hand, is an event where the primary goal is relationship building. You're not asking for donations. You're not holding a raffle. You're usually not charging people to come in. The success of a fundraising event is determined by, of course, the amount of money you bring in, your return on investment, revenue over expenses. The cultivation event is, how would you measure the success of that? And it's based on the number of new donor connections and the number of current donor relationships that are strengthened by the event. So it can be a little woo-woo to measure the cultivation event. But so what they really get into is understanding your fundraising event ROI, return on investments. If you've never run a fundraising event or tried to put on a gala for a nonprofit, or say like a silent auction or something, you might be amazed to know that they are sometimes not very profitable at all. There can be a lot of work and administrative work that goes in behind the scenes to even put one of these things on. And so making sure that you know what your return on investment is before you engage in one is probably a good idea. And especially if there's an economic downturn, if you barely squeak by during good times while you're doing a fundraising event, do you dare enter this in when the economy is bad? So, and one of the quotes here from the author's friend is, in uncertain times, it is best to stick with the tried and true. So understanding that, say you were going to try a new event, you see this economic downturn coming, they're kind of suggesting that you stick with what has worked in the past. They also talk about event sponsorship, leadership gifts, building different relationships with event sponsors. So having people that want to be there, an advertising opportunity for local businesses where they can also give back, and you're sponsoring the event to offload some of those costs. And so that the true donations can actually go to not covering the expenses of the event, but actually what you need the funds for coming into the nonprofit and helping it. They want to talk about building deeper relationships with event sponsors. Why is that event sponsor sponsoring you? Take the approach to, strengthen that relationship at the same time. They talk about put all event attendees into your cultivation stream. Anybody that's holding one of these events, if you're not capturing who's coming and putting them into your donor database, you're silly for even holding the thing without even trying to remember that. So, but I think the final kind of paragraph here is kind of the crux of what they're getting at. The most important thing when times are bad is to continue to focus on and invest in fundraising. Events can be a important part of that strategy, provided that the return on your investment and time and money makes the events worthwhile. So I thought it was an interesting article, kind of beats around the bush a bit for, I think, what is a very simple premise in my mind, but I don't think it's often talked about. So Mark, I'd love to get your thoughts on this one and see what you think.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I think we have some recent evidence of how this potential economic downturn, let's face it, it's probably inevitable at this point, especially with the number of articles coming out about it. But anyway, we have some recent evidence with COVID, right? And with the pandemic, how fundraising and events had to kind of shift and how people had to turn to fundraising online and fundraisers at home. And we've talked about that, ad nauseum on the podcast in the past. But I think the idea here is when times get lean, you're going to have some haves and have-nots, and basically focus on the haves, right? Focus on those who already have money and try to squeeze more money out of them. I know I'm being a bit callous with that, but, go to your major donors and try to get more money out of them. Go to your sponsors, try to get more money out of them. Don't completely look at, at canceling all events or, but you want to have a presence, right? Because events are sometimes there, not just for the return on investment for the events, but they're also there so that you have a public facing connection with people. And as the article mentioned, you can build your donor database with all the people that attend these events. But you really want to look at your fundraisers. You really want to look at those people who have money, have already shown that they can give money, and see if you can increase their donations year over year. Get that return on your investment that you've kind of already made, because you've already gotten these investors and these donors in the front door. So, major gifts, etc. This is going to scale differently depending on the size of your organization. But I think being mindful that you're not spending too much of your capital on throwing big galas and throwing big events when people might not have the appetite to be spending that kind of money, to go to some celebrity charity auction. So I think overall it's an interesting article.
Yeah, I think one thing the article doesn't mention that I think should be mentioned is the kind of inverse relationship fundraising. Well, really there's two main sources of revenue for a nonprofit: grants and contracts, or, and fundraising. And there's kind of an inverse relationship when economy is good and an economy is bad. Like fundraising plummets, of course, when the economy is bad. People don't have as much discretionary income to give as when times are good. And the same is kind of true for grants, depending on what type of grant you're getting. But when times are bad, the government is much more willing to lend out. State, local, national, federal government is much more willing to hand out grants to stabilize a faltering economy through the nonprofit sector than they would be and when times are plentiful. So I think, kind of understanding that as a fundraising base is a good idea, and looking at, like what's that mix of, foundation grants, local, state government grants to fundraising in your organization, and understanding.
Yeah, AJ, I mean, we can't really fault the article because the title of the article is events, right? But
sure.
I bet you we could, I'd be willing to make a wager right here on the podcast that in the next couple of weeks, we see another article with the same name, grants.
Right? We'll keep an eye out. Joe, if you're listening, we love your article. Write one on grants.
We'll look for the next one here.
We'll talk about it again. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw it out there though, because I think it's something that fundraisers should think about is, what that mix of, public funding versus, for lack of a better word, governmental or private funding. The other thing to note is corporations tend to do good and times of good and times of bad. So look to your, and they mentioned that in the article, corporate sponsors, corporate donations. So just hedging your bets on all sides and not falling into the folly of having, your revenue stream undiversified and relying on individuals or a few people or a few grants. Spreading it out is always good. So speaking of spreading out, Mark, you have our next article here, and sounds kind of interesting. I'm kind of excited about this one. So
yeah, this is from our friends over at the Stanford Social Innovation Review. We're big fanboys here on the podcast. And this one's called How Not to Scale a Nonprofit by Casey Harden. And this is more an anecdotal story about a nonprofit down in South America that had a good, effective nonprofit helping out youth in a particular town. And then they were asked to expand and to take their existing nonprofit model and move it to another town. And as a result of doing that, combined with the pandemic, so I mean, it's a little bit hard to do experiments in the void, but this caused the original nonprofit to no longer be able to succeed and to no longer be able to help the original audience that it had been started for. So when we're looking at nonprofits, I think the takeaways from this experiment, or from the nonprofit world, is that they're looking for sustainability and looking at when you should scale and when you should not scale. And so in our kind of for-profit world that we live in, there's this capitalistic notion that we always need to grow, we always need to expand, we should take our model and franchise it if possible. We should systematize this model and see how it scales globally and see how sustainable it is. But I think when you're a nonprofit, right, you have the option to say, I don't necessarily need to do that. I don't need to be so focused on growth, And so some of the points this article brings out, there's no shame in focusing on quality over quantity. You don't necessarily need to think about how big can I get my nonprofit. You can keep it super local and keep it super interested for your community, and see how much quality and how good you can make that nonprofit, instead of growing it year over year. And having dependence on donations is not a sin, right? Having a donor base that you can go back to, that you can ask for money, and keeping that your revenue stream, and having a sustaining expected amount coming in, is not a problem. You don't necessarily need to be going for grants. You don't necessarily need to be growing outsized in different ways that you haven't expanded your fundraising before. We talked about this in the last 2 podcasts with the 10 different ways that you can be sort of receiving revenue in your nonprofit. And if you know that your donation track works, there's no real downside to keeping that going and relying on that. I mean, diversification might be a problem, but be comfortable with where you're currently doing. Believing that you can do anything is great, but believing that you can do everything is foolish. So this makes the point that trying to diversify your programs, trying to diversify your streams of how you can bring this out far and wide, can cause for the demise of your organization. As you get spread too thin, you might not have the infrastructure to do this. You might not be well-versed and experienced enough in other categories, that as you start to experiment, as happened with this nonprofit, it causes the original mission to start to waver and eventually fail. And finally, you don't need to leave the business world to benefit society. So this is kind of the author saying, well, I moved from nonprofit world back into for-profit world, but I'm still able to help these original people in working in a for-profit world. So, there is no shame in moving from the nonprofit sphere to the for-profit sphere, and know that you can still do good work. There are still organizations and companies that do some of these sponsorships that we were talking about earlier, that do help support, nonprofits in a void. They probably wouldn't be as successful as having partnerships with for-profit companies, so that they can use those resources to help grow. Interesting article. And, in our world of scaling and growing constantly, it's not necessary to do this in nonprofit world, and think about what's best for you and your organization. AJ.
Yeah, I think it points out a good, heartbreaking to hear the story about this nonprofit that helped so many people going by the wayside. And I think the article is written really as a look back by the author on, what led to the demise of his nonprofit, essentially, and trying to make that better is kind of, or trying to, find light, I think, in the darkness of that, he experienced by having to close that nonprofit. But I'd also say that I think some of this can be a little. This guy obviously, I think, thinks pretty highly of himself, as well he should. Sounds like he did a lot of good, but I think the hubris, or the part of the story that I think is kind of not talked about in the article so much as it's written by this person's point of view is, maybe the believing you can do everything is powerful, but believing you can do anything is powerful, but believing you can do everything is foolish. I mean, I think that's a really big, kind of bold statement there. I took it a little bit differently, and I think about, if we were relating this to like a public accounting firm where there's a very partner-centric or leader-centric kind of organization, that this has all happened because of me, and it really needs me to continue. I would think, in looking at kind of the story of how this helped gangs in a very specific neighborhood and was able to get people out of a life of crime and into productive parts of society. And then it talks about the misgivings of trying to spread that out to a different region and not understanding that region that they were going into. I'm almost wondering if they would have, engaged somebody in that community that could have seen those differences first. And so I don't think scaling for a nonprofit is bad. You just can't look at it like you're scaling a new Shake Shack or In-N-Out or a restaurant or a franchise. That's not the model that nonprofits should work on. What made one very regional specific nonprofit work may not work in another region, but the concept of what's happening could. And so engaging somebody in that region or in that area specific would have been, I think, 1,000 times better than just trying to mull over the same thing that you did in a very specific way. And so the most successful nonprofits I've worked with that have grown through, there is some standardization of what they're doing. There's some, engaging professionals and paying them their worth to be able to duplicate or expand services into a different area or into a different way that would encapsulate something that's outside of what you currently do. Or if you have a really good thing going, being able to hire good employees that can continue this scaling, I think is important. And being able to pass off that responsibility and not seeing it as a founder program defining specific thing and look more outward to see how you can help, I think is really what I take away from the article and what I've seen work in nonprofits.
Yeah, there is that founder problem, AJ, that we probably will cover again on future podcasts, of being so close to the nonprofit that you start that its success or failure gets completely wrapped up in your own ego and your own personal levels of success and failure. And that's tricky, right? Because if you try to grow and you fail, then you fail as a person as well as just failing as an organization. And I think that's a lesson here as well. So,
and I think there's, and I can see it, right? You've started something, you have a deep emotional connection to this.
Yeah, it's your baby.
Yeah. Think of Mark, you and your partner have a nonprofit that you're very close to. It'd be very difficult to remove, Rick from the nonprofit, or the founder that has spent years trying to do this and is at a level that they see it. It can be very introspective to say, I want to see it do more good and step away than to continue doing what's doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. That one hits close to home, AJ.
Ouch. Oh, no. Sorry. I didn't make it too deep on the podcast. We can cut that part out if you want.
That's all good. All right. I think you got our next article for us. I mean, not article. Sorry. I'm all discombobulated.
Question of the week.
AJ, question of the week.
So we got, this is an interesting one. So this is talking about, the question poses let me start over. This is a tongue twister here. Leveraging analytics and defining KPIs, key performance indices for a nonprofit. So this person this is very specific to kind of like a digital footprint, website content, and talking about development and how they can track a campaign success. So they're asking what key performance indicators and how they can leverage analytics to determine whether or not a specific fundraising event or campaign is successful. And so I thought we could talk about that, but I also think we can talk about KPIs or modeling for a nonprofit and how that would look, and the different options that are there. So realistically, they're talking about a website analytics, page dollars, dollar per visit. They're really talking about leveraging analytics from like an online campaign. But my thought was, when reading this, was how does that define into a KPI or analytic for for a nonprofit organization as a whole, not just around donor dollars, but around, a good operating sense. I can kind of start with what I think would be good KPIs for like donations, because I think that's, kind of the jumping off point that this person is looking at. But I would say,
AJ, let's talk first generally as to why KPIs, right? I don't think this is a topic we've discussed on the podcast before. And I think it's also one we could probably devote a whole podcast to, because there's a lot of depth and complexity. But for those who might not be familiar with what a key performance indicator is, you want to jump in and just kind of talk about what it does and why we would use it?
Yeah, it's almost like a scorecard or key performance. So indicator, meaning like you're choosing 1, 2, or 3 indicators or metrics that you can measure, quantitatively, and understand that as they shift up or down, that's going to result in different either income levels, satisfaction, job satisfaction in a nonprofit. So you're really talking about these levers or measures that really define or are identified as being the key performance metrics in an organization. This has long been used in for-profit, and they talk a lot about, like KPI modeling, financial planning and analysis modeling is really around this KPI. You hear a lot about like utilization and realization if you're in that world of either working more or working more efficiently, getting more done in a certain amount of time or just working more time is really the two key metrics that like the for-profit business uses. There's a lot of other ones, how quick you turn your AR over, your average inventory carrying costs. And I don't necessarily know that those translate one-to-one to a nonprofit. First of all, for the most part, nonprofits don't carry inventory, and how much you turn your inventory doesn't really indicate how well your nonprofit is doing. So that's really where hopefully I'm defining KPI correctly. Mark, feel free to jump in if you have a more simplistic view here.
I think that's a good definition. I would just add to that and say, really, a KPI is helping an organization make some decisions, right? Because what you're doing is you're taking data and you're quantifying it, right? And us accountants love numbers, right? So if you can take your data of what's going on in your organization and quantify it in some way, and we'll talk about some of these KPIs for nonprofits specifically, but if you take this data and you quantify it, then you can sort of start to measure it against other periods of time. You can say, okay, let's adapt. Let's try to get our number of visitors, I'll just throw one out there, up in this specific from 1 month to another month at a museum, right? That is a KPI. That's a performance indicator where it's showing me how many visitors I have coming through the front door. So that is quantifiable. You're able to adapt to it by trying different things. And then it helps you to sort of measure what your organizational objectives are being met, right? Are we meeting what those needs are? And it can really help to determine, are we in a space to grow? Do we need to contract a little bit because our KPIs are way out there and we're spending way too much money for very little return on what we're getting back for that? So I think it's really about quantification and being able to help your organization make decisions.
I also want to point out that great definition and great examples, Mark. I also want to point out that for any nonprofits that are listening and like, wow, we should really be doing KPI monitoring or cash flow projections or anything that'll help us plan for the future. If you don't have, and I want to make this very clear, if you don't have your underlying accounting data and a good data source to be able to pull from, you're not going to glean much from trying to cobble it together with missing or incomplete or garbage information. So garbage in, garbage out still holds true here. You can't just start monitoring KPIs and making decisions off of them if the underlying information is not complete. So I want to make that clear before we jump in and, we possibly get a bunch of phone calls that people want to do cash flow or KPI monitoring when they haven't addressed the underlying accounting issue underneath, and being able to get that dialed in. So whether you're in development or you're in accounting, that's really the two places where I can see this KPI. Well, HR too. If we're talking about KPIs of employee happiness or job satisfaction, that can also be measured. So this isn't just a financial measure when we're talking about KPIs and analytics. It's really can be manipulated. You can take data and glean from it a lot of different things. HR departments use this for job satisfaction and willingness to stay, that kind of thing, happiness in the job. As accountants use it for cash flow modeling, understanding the levers of what makes your Mark mentioned visitors to a museum. Often KPIs are very employee centric or payroll centric for a nonprofit. Realistically, for the most part, museums, that was a great example of something that's different. That would really drive that. Visitors, meaning that presumably if you have more visitors, you're getting more revenue in the front door because people are seeing it. Even if you're not charging an admission, people are feeling like they need to donate because they went there and saw something amazing. So I think you really need to take a step back and look at the nonprofit and understand what those levers are, that when you move them, they're bringing a change, good or bad, right? Because even a bad metrics of like, let's look at like the HR example of somebody being unhappy at their job. If you crank up unhappiness, productivity, revenue, wasted time all goes up. And that's like a negative KPI. So you would want happiness to be the, like employee job satisfaction. Are they being challenged? Are they being given upward mobility? Something like that that's tracked in HR.
AJ, while we're on the people KPI, I think this is important. Also, I'm going to just jump right in here.
Sure.
I think you can also, with a nonprofit, measure two other very important KPIs related to people. Donor happiness, right? Are donors feeling like they're giving to something that's helping to successfully complete this mission? Are they feeling engaged in the process? You can be surveying your donors and saying, how satisfied are you with the work that our nonprofit is doing? That's a really important metric, because if your donors aren't happy, you're definitely looking at a contraction in the future, right? The other one is the beneficiary satisfaction, right? If your nonprofit is specifically a food bank, is out there to help the community, or whatever, some sort of educational organization that is there to serve the community or serve a certain number of people. Are the people who are being served happy? Are they feeling like they're getting the most out of this? And if the KPIs on that are tracked, you can see over time, look, our beneficiaries are getting more out of the programs. And that's something you can take straight to your donors and use in development materials for fundraising. So again, I'm very passionate about this topic because there's so much you can do with these KPIs. And really, it's just a matter of gathering the data. And your organization might already have some of this data, and you can even do historical stuff like, we've been collecting this data for years, but we've never really compared it or used it in a specific way when looking at this. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, AJ, but
no. And actually, I think it's a good segue to exactly the point I was moving on to. Was I think often people hear KPI or analytics and they think, oh man, now I have to install a whole new measuring system or data collection system. But I would argue that if you're in the business of delivering services like Mark talked about to a certain population of people or to the community, that you probably are already tracking some of this information that you would need to say, understand how satisfied your constituents are with what you're doing. So I think looking within and seeing what, especially if you have like a government grant, often you're having to report on how many people you are serving, even a foundation grant in a very narrative driven way. How many people did you reach? It's maybe just an extra step to ask them how satisfied they were, what they would like to see the program expand to, how they would change their interaction with who they met with, and collecting that type of information, from participants would be excellent in being able to, not only report on the grant, but be able to then turn around and use that information internally instead of just a box to check that you needed to get done for a grant report. So the same thing is true when we're talking about like cash flow modeling or KPIs in the financial realm. You probably already have, if you're doing a good job closing your books and you're keeping the underlying books and records clean and correct, you probably already have the information that you would need to put one of these models together. The problem in the nonprofit sector is, I think a lot of financial departments in the nonprofit sector and small to medium-sized nonprofits don't ever get there because they're bogged down with the necessities of reporting underneath it. We get very complacent when we think we have something licked. We're passing our audits, we're getting our grant reporting done on time, we're invoicing, we're staying up on cash collections, we have money in the bank. Why do we need to put another onus on us to do a cash flow model if we have money in the bank? We're not in a cash crunch. Why do we need to look at what our future planning is, what our future budgeting is, what our KPIs are if we're doing well? And I think the real reason is to be able to monitor cash flow, because you're not going to see a cash flow problem until it's all gone. You're not going to see a dip in productivity or a stagnation of programs unless you're monitoring this. You're not going to see a stagnation of revenue until you're monitoring this kind of stuff. And you're able to, get an idea of what's coming, I think.
Yeah. And I think a lot of organizations are already doing KPI monitoring without realizing that that's what they're doing, right? Even if you're doing it intuitively, right? Where you go, it feels like our donations are down, or it feels like we're not engaging as many donors, right? This process just for the love of us accountants, makes it quantifiable where you can actually look and take that feeling like we don't feel as successful as we used to be, and switching that over into something where we can actually then convert that into something real. So I have some KPI metrics for nonprofits specifically that I just want to throw out there. Some things you can track. We're not going to go into detail on too many of these, but these are just sort of some of the ideas that you would have. So gifts secured, right? How many gifts did you secure over the year? What was your donation growth year over year, right? Did you bring in more donors? Do you have more donation growth? What is your donor retention rate, right? That's a big one that most development departments are tracking in any case. What is your fundraising return on investment, right? For every fundraiser you have, how much money did you actually bring in, and which kinds of fundraising are successful versus others? And then, if you have donation conversions by channel, right? Like we do events and we bring in this amount. We do a fundraiser and we bring in this amount. We do this X, Y, and Z, and this brings in this amount. So comparing them to see which kind of donation is worthwhile. The original asker of this question talked about website page views and click-through rates. Those are very generic, but can be important to see how much engagement you have. So the list goes on and on. Year over year growth, operating surplus, how much are you able to put into your reserve year over year, and what are you tracking there? Program efficiencies. You can look at your different programs and see how efficient they are and how many people they're serving. So anyway, that's a non-exhaustive list, but you can see how these KPIs can work for multiple departments as we discussed earlier.
Put myself on mute there. I also think, like a good one to point out is the employee, like realistically, your key performance indicator for most nonprofits, I think, are employees. And I think if you look at, I would say 95% of nonprofits' financial statements, the largest expense that they have is revolves around personnel. And so to be able to deliver services, programs, grants, anything like that, it all revolves around having good people in place that are trained to be able to deliver those services. So I would argue that any KPI around revenue, cash flow, anything like that needs to be centered around your payroll costs or your and your employee happiness and readiness to deliver those services. Like we use, I hate to go back to the same example, but we're using, job satisfaction or engagement through an HR department. If you can have that at a very high level and you have employees that are trained and ready to go, you're going to have a much higher return from the projects that you're doing, from the outreach that you're doing, from the services that you're delivering. A well-trained staff and a well-engaged staff is going to manage a grant much more than kind of a top-down authoritarian view of what you spent your money on and how you spent it. The program manager, the grant manager, all those people that would manage that, if they're well trained and understand their job role, given the good information that they're using, can deliver at scale. I hate to use the word, but at scale, your programs and offerings in a much more streamlined manner, in a much more effective manner that will come back to you, the nonprofit, and reap the benefits more than if you're just scattershotting people out into the community to try and spread your message and services.
All right. Well, that was quite a juicy email, and our KPIs tell us that we really appreciate more interaction and engagement with the audience, and keep those questions coming, and we'll keep these podcasts coming, and we certainly appreciate you being here with us today. Of course, reach out to us on Twitter at ProfitlessPod. Feel free to comment on the videos below, and if you're feeling so inclined, tell your friends about it. Tell your accountant friends. Maybe your non-accountant friends might not be so interested, but we'd always love more listeners, and we always love more engagement on the podcast. And we certainly appreciate your time and taking some time out to sit with us this week. And we look forward, on behalf of AJ and myself, we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Thanks, everybody.